Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. In 1826, in Glasgow, Scotland, the first ever rescue mission was opened. In 1872, on Water Street in New York City, the first rescue mission on the American continent was opened. It's 145 years later. Things have changed quite a bit. No one in this room will disagree that our culture is changing at an alarming pace. It's rapidly changing. Cultural norms, morals, acceptable behaviors are being overturned on what seems to be a daily basis. We all see it, we all feel it. Along with that, the culture of homelessness is changing. The conditions of homelessness, the who, the why, are all evolving so rapidly it's becoming difficult to keep up. Rescue is no longer a simple proposition, if I could use this illustration. It's one thing to rescue someone from a still pond. It's another thing to rescue someone from an icy, raging river. It's become more and more difficult all the time. It is evident now to those of us who work in the homeless ministry that the assumptions, the approaches, the models that we used even a short time ago are no longer as effective as they were yesterday. It doesn't mean that what we did yesterday was wrong. It just means that the culture is changing and we have to recognize it and change our models along with it. In our world where electronic access to communication and information is instant, where there's no longer the barrier of travel, where the population is becoming used to receiving goods and services without any personal investment on their part, where the dignity of individuals is not increasing but decreasing, we recognize we need to make changes to remain effective and to truly love people well. There has been some tremendous fruit from this ministry, but our culture is at a pivot point. And those of us who minister in this area, that includes you. We minister to the have-nots, the will-nots, and the can-nots. We need to look up, and like Jesus says in Luke 12, understand the signs of the times. Our guest speaker, Bob Lupton, has been doing that for over 40 years. He's been working in urban renewal in Atlanta, Georgia. While he was still serving in the jungles of Vietnam, he felt the call to work with delinquent youth. He left a promising business career with his family and moved into Atlanta's inner city to become a community developer, and you're going to find out what that means in just a few minutes. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Georgia. He's a speaker, an author, a strategist, an inspirational leader, and I found out last night and today that he's an all-around good guy. Bob has written a number of books that have significantly influenced our approach to homeless ministry over the past few years. He's thoughtful, he's provocative, he has great insight. You'll not only be challenged, but you'll really enjoy hearing from him. Let's welcome him to our stage.
It's a delight to be with you. I've had the opportunity to see the amazing ministry that you are committed to. You may or may not know this, but you folks are on a cutting edge. You're making changes in the methodology, the way you're approaching homelessness, that is an example to the nation. It's an honor for me to not only recognize that, but to speak about what is happening. As Al mentioned, I was, 47 years ago now, I was in the jungles of Vietnam. We've got enough gray hair in the audience to know that some of you remember that. That was, we had a draft back in those days, and if you didn't have a college deferment, you were rounded up and sent off to the war. I was in a position there that allowed me to work with some of the young men who brought their share of trouble with them. Over there, the drugs were very cheap and very pure, and a lot of those kids got strung out pretty badly. So I was in a position where I could set up an amnesty drug abuse program, high school GED courses, even some college courses that help those young people come back to the United States with a better opportunity to succeed. I thought it would be a wasted year of my life. In fact, it turned out to be a pivotal year. God used those experiences to ignite within my spirit a sense of calling that I could not escape. And so I eventually, when I got out of the military, left my business career, started a program with a juvenile court in Atlanta, working with troubled young men. Didn't take very long to figure out that you can't work very effectively with troubled young men apart from their family situations. And so I went back to school to learn how to work with families and expanded our work to include the families, only to discover that you can't work very effectively with struggling families apart from the environment that impacts on them every time they step out of the door, which got me more involved with what was happening with the police and on the street and in the schools. And over time, began to dawn on me that if you were going to change an environment, clearly the best way to affect that change is to work from within, to become a part of that environment and work for change from the inside. That's an insight that one doesn't share readily with one's spouse. Matter of fact, we were just in the process of building my bride's new dream home, a little farther out into the suburbs. And I remember the night that it happened. We'd gone to bed early. We were about 5 weeks away from moving into our new house. And that's when you're picking out the carpet and the light fixtures and the cabinetry. This is high energy stuff. And Peggy just wanted to talk. And I said, I don't think you want to talk to me tonight. And she said, oh no, what's wrong? And I said, I don't think God wants us moving farther out of the city. I think he wants us moving into the city. That was a bad night. In the morning, Peggy said, is this your idea or God's idea? Because if it's your idea, I'm not interested at all. She said, I want it in writing. And so that was the first time I articulated and wrote a 7-page letter describing what I felt was a calling. And she took that letter around to her girlfriends and our small group leader and our pastors to get 4, 5, 6 different opinions, and finally concluded that that at least I believed that it was a calling. And if it really is, then what choice do you really have? So it's a tribute to Peggy's spiritual depth that she let go of her vision to have a new home in a good environment, to raise our boys with good friends in good schools, the kind of upbringing she had had. To let go of that and move into the heart of a high-crime neighborhood in the city that seemed like a very strange, dangerous place to raise a family. That was about a 10-year learning curve for me. I'd been commuting in and out of the city, doing some really pretty good programs. I felt very good about it. One of those programs that created the most excitement was at Christmas time. We called it Adopt a Family for Christmas. And I would identify the kids that were not going to get anything for Christmas and give those names and addresses to caring people from around the city. They'd go shopping, and on Christmas Eve would deliver those toys to the homes of these children. And it created a lot of excitement. But the first year we were living in the neighborhood, that was the first time I had time on my hands to be able to sit in the homes of some of the recipient families when the gift-bearing families arrived. And I saw something that I had never noticed before. Of course, the kids were all excited. The moms were gracious, maybe a little embarrassed. But if there was a dad in the household, he just disappeared. He was gone out the back door. And it dawned on me what was happening was that these parents in front of their children were being exposed for their inability to provide. And the moms would endure that indignity for the sake of the kids. But it was just more than a father's sense of pride, his dignity could handle. It was as though his impotence was being exposed in front of his wife and children in his own home. It was killing him. It was a devastating thing to see. I wondered if this kind of indignity was going on in the other programs that we had started, we're doing. There was a book that I got a hold of by a French theologian by the name of Jacques Ellul. He was writing about poverty and issues, urban issues. Got a hold of a book, and this quote jumped off the page at me. Ellul said, almsgiving, that's the old word for charity. Almsgiving is Mammon's perversion of giving. It affirms the superiority of the giver. It binds the recipient and demands gratitude. It humiliates him and reduces him to a lower state than he had before. Can you see why that hit me right in the gut? We were certainly not there to do damage to anyone, certainly not to humiliate our neighbors, certainly not to reduce them to a lower state. We were there to affirm, to encourage, to build up. It was devastating to me. And I thought maybe we're just doing more harm than good here in this community. I started looking at patterns in the way we were giving out our charity. I noticed that if I would give somebody something one time, it almost always elicited appreciation. Thank you very much. It was a surprise, a delight. If I give somebody something twice, I've created just a little bit of anticipation. Oh, I wonder if he's going to start, this is a program. Wonder if he's going to continue doing this. By the third time, I created an expectation. I know he does this. He'll probably do it again. I need to position myself to get where the next installment is coming. And by the fourth time, it's become an entitlement. I would rather have a ham this Thanksgiving than a turkey, thank you. I have a choice in this. You owe me. It's an entitlement. And by the fifth time, it's just pure dependency. You can't take it away now. I'm counting on this. I'm depending on this. I saw that spiral repeat itself over and over again in the way that we were doing our ministry. Kind of one-way giving that wasn't asking for anything in return. It felt, in a way, it felt spiritual. But it wasn't producing the kind of results that we had hoped. And so he said, we're going to cut it out. We're just going to stop this giving away. The only time we're going to give stuff to people is when they're in a moment, when they're in a time of crisis. Whereupon the incidence of crises skyrocketed. Everybody had a crisis. And I said, no, wait a second. There's a difference here between a crisis is when some calamity befalls you over which you have no control. But chronic need, that's a result of a series of decisions. So if you address a crisis need with a crisis intervention, an emergency intervention. It's absolutely the right thing to do. But when the immediate crisis has been passed, when the supplies have been passed out, when the medical treatment has been given, now it's time to help folks rebuild their lives, rebuild their homes. You shift into a development phase. If you address a crisis need, I found, with a crisis intervention, people are helped. Lives are saved. It's the right thing to do. On the other hand, if you address a chronic need with a crisis intervention, people are harmed. Let me give you an example of that. You remember Katrina that hit New Orleans about a dozen years ago? That was a crisis. And as a nation, we responded with emergency supplies. It was not very orderly, but it was the right thing to do, and lives were saved as a result. That's a dozen years ago. I was in New Orleans last year, and you know what's going on there 12 years later? There are convoys of caring people loaded down with emergency supplies, taking those in to minister to the victims of Katrina. You get that? Victims. They've created a whole victim class of people whose livelihood is dependent on the ongoing outpouring of compassion, and it has created a whole culture of dependency. It's what happens when you address what is clearly chronic need with an emergency response. So in our culture, what about hunger? Is hunger chronic or crisis? You could kind of make a case. You could see it happening both ways, right? What about starvation? Is that crisis or chronic? That's easier, isn't it? Starvation is a crisis need. That's when a sub-Saharan famine sweeps through the continent, and people are dying of hunger. That's a crisis, and that's where you send in airlifts of food and nourishment, clothes to folks in a crisis situation. But in our country, we don't have starvation. We have hunger. You know, in 46 years of serving and living in inner city Atlanta, I have yet to see the first starving person. Not one. I've seen food insecurity. I've seen moms feed their kids peanut butter sandwiches the last 4 days of the month. I've seen a lot of bad nutrition. I've seen homeless men dumpster dive. But starvation, no, I haven't seen starvation. And yet when you look at the way we distribute food in our culture, we are giving emergency food to those that are clearly in a chronic state of need. Remember the old adage, teach a man a fish, he eats for a day, or give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach him to fish, he eats for a lifetime. Remember that one? Well, we've got fish feeding stations set up all over the place when we should have fish teaching stations where folks are learning how to catch their own fish and support their own families. And yet we persist in doing emergency responses to chronic need. There's a reason why the poor stay poor in our culture. And it may not be all their fault. It may have something to do with the way we are dispensing our charity. So he said we've got to change it all. We've got to change our paradigm. We said we've got to develop a whole different attitude about our neighbors. Instead of seeing them as people in need, we've got to start seeing them as people with resources, people with abilities, people with talents. And that no one is so poor that they have nothing to bring to the table. Nobody is that poor. Everybody has something to offer. Now, admittedly, there are some groups that it's a little harder to see what they have to offer. We've got a lot of seniors in our community, the Meals on Wheels recipients, and many of them are homebound. So what can they bring to the table? Well, they're the ones that are looking out through the Venetian blinds, watching everything that goes on the street, and talking to their neighbors up and down the street. There's your crime watch. Those are very valuable people. If you harness them, if you organize them, if you affirm them, very valuable people. What about those darn kids that spray graffiti all over everything and just mess up the community? What do they have to contribute? Have you ever noticed that some of that graffiti is a bit artful? Have you noticed that? Right down the middle of our neighborhood, for 2 blocks, there's a 8-foot-high corrugated metal fence. There's a junkyard on the other side. It's covered with graffiti. It's a blight. And so we started talking with some of the taggers. They spray their tags, right? We started talking to some of the taggers. We said, would you guys be willing to use your talent to try to make this place look a little better? We'll buy all the spray cans you want. And so they agreed, yeah, they would do that. And so over the next couple of weeks, they got out and started spray painting what they thought was beautiful stuff on that wall. And actually, it turned out to be amazingly creative. As a matter of fact, they put figures that would make you aspire to higher things like education. One of our families wanted their picture taken in front of a section of that wall that looked like a bright future for the community. Everybody has something to bring to the table. The kid that did that particular stretch of the wall, we went to him and asked him if he would be willing to do a mural on the side of our ministry center, something that would make it attractive when you come into the community. He said, we commissioned him. We pay him and give him all the spray cans he wants. And so that's what he did on the side of our building. When you come into the community, that's what greets the visitor's eyes. That's a work of art. You know, that's been 4 years now. There's not a mark of graffiti on any of that. Now there's a sense of ownership and pride. Everybody has something to contribute. And so we said, we've got to have some new marching orders. We adopted what has become for us our golden rule of effective service, and it's this: I'll never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. When I do for others what they can do for themselves, I disempower them. I take pressure onto myself that was never designed for me to carry. I disempower those who I would help. And so we adopted this as our golden rule, and then set about changing our entire system. The first big one was changing our Adopt-A Family program. The second Christmas that we were in the community, as folks started calling in for their adopted family, we said, would you give an extra gift this year? Would you give a gift of dignity to the dads? And here's how you do it. Go shopping, buy the toys, don't wrap them. Bring them down, we'll set up in a storefront, we'll call it the old Christmas shop, and we'll put somewhere between a wholesale and a garage sale price on those toys. And we'll invite parents to come in and go shopping. And if they're unemployed and they just don't have any money, well, we're creating some cash flow here. That means we can hire some of those parents so that they will have the money to buy for their children. Well, that's a stretch, asking folks to let us sell the toys that they're used to giving. But when we explained we're going to use the proceeds of this to set up an employment training program that will enable unemployed parents to be trained and moved into the marketplace so that this time next Christmas, they will be fully supporting of their own families. And we explained it that way, folks got it. I asked them for an extra gift. I said, you know that feeling that you have when you see those kids all excited about the toys you bring? You know that rush of emotion? That's what I want you to give to the dads, so that on Christmas morning, they will have that rush of emotion in seeing their kids open the gifts that they have purchased through the efforts of their own hands. And there will be dignity in the process of exchange. We came to realize that it's a responsibility of those of us that are stewards of resources to set up systems of reciprocity, where folks give and receive, where everybody has something to give. We learned a couple things. We changed the name of Adopt a Family. We changed it to Pride for Parents. It's our Christmas time promotion. And we found out a couple of very interesting things that first year. One is that we learned that parents would a whole lot rather work to earn, to purchase those toys that they knew would delight their kids than they would stand in a free toy lines with their proof of poverty and accept gifts that someone else had picked out for their children. We learned that. We learned another truth, a universal truth, I believe, universal, that's for all people of all times. It's this: everyone loves to find a bargain. Universal. So Peggy was out this last Christmas shopping, a grueling day of Christmas shopping. And she came home and lugged all her bags in, spread her treasures out all around the living room for me to admire. And she said, and you know what? I saved more than I spent. I'm not an economist. Somebody that understands high finance will have to explain that one. But I do know this: she was excited about finding bargains. So why do we think it would be such a blessing to the poor to set up a system that deprives the poor of the joy of finding and purchasing bargains for their own children? Why do we think that would be a blessing? We had a clothes closet. That was an easy one to start. But it didn't go as well as we expected it to. Lots of donated clothes were given, and we invited our community in and said, these are the free gifts of God's people, help yourself. Been freely given, freely receive. It was a good spirit until we actually opened the doors and folks came charging in and grabbing up as many armfuls of clothes as they could carry out, and then I'd find them scattered around outside. I realized that wasn't good stewardship. And so we hastily drew up rules and posted them. Limit the number of garments per visit, limit the number of visits per month. And that was like saying, let the games begin. Can we get some garments for our kids that are in school? Yeah, that's reasonable. Can I get some garments for my sick uncle who can't get in here today? You just know where that's going. In no time, we're behaving like temple police, guarding the resources of the kingdom against the very folks we were there to serve among. It turned into an adversarial relationship almost overnight. Not what we had in mind at all. We had in mind sharing our lives, sharing our resources, not being guards against our neighbor's greed. And so I was sharing this with it was a Methodist men's group that had helped us collect clothes, and I was sharing this dilemma, and they said, well, there's a simple answer to that. You know how those that aren't there always have the simple answers. Do we have any Methodists in the crowd today? I won't take any risk. Methodists are very smart people, especially the men, and they can see things that normal folks can't. They said, yeah, there's a solution to this, pretty simple. It's called the market. You put a fair rate of exchange on a desired commodity, it cuts all that out. I said, really? Oh, yeah. So I said, would you help us set that up? Well, they had a meeting, and they said, yeah, we'll take this on as our men's missions project this year. And those guys set about doing what they cannot help doing even in their sleep. Got to have a business plan, traffic flow patterns, real estate research, shop the competition. We've got to bring this in right underneath the Goodwill Industries thrift store. I said, if we do it right, we can train folks in retail merchandising, move them into the market. They said it'd take about 2 years for a small business like this to break even, and they were right. About 18 months later, that little clothes closet turned thrift store turned into profit, and it's been a bright spot in the community ever since. And those guys were absolutely right. It changed the dynamic totally. The dynamic between giver and recipient, where the giver has to make sure the recipient doesn't get too much. And the dynamic between merchant and customer, where the merchant needs the customer to buy all that they can afford to buy because that's how he keeps the lights on. That's how he meets payroll. He needs those customers. And I want to tell you that our neighbors began to see that they were needed, wanted. Had 4 trainees that we hired from the community, and they immediately sized it up that their paycheck was dependent on whether sales came in. So their relationship with their customers became much more personal. We went out to see how the real stores did at the shopping malls, and they took notes. And on the debrief, they said, well, they had the big for sale signs right when you come in the door, and the latest fashion arrivals, and all the hangers were going the same way, and they were all sized, some even color coordinated. And one of the women said, yeah, you know, and those stores smell nice too. You know, when it's used clothes, sometimes it can be a bit stale, and you can't afford to dry clean everything. So our trainee said, what could we do to make this store smell nicer? Well, they said we ought to have a pot of coffee going in the morning, and maybe we could do some microwave cookies. And so you walk into the store, and the aroma of fresh brewed coffee and cookies greets your nostrils. That's about making people feel valued. It changed the dynamic totally. We changed our food pantry. We turned that from a giveaway program into a food co-op, kind of a buying co-op, where folks put their $5 in, and we went to the community food bank and got a whole bunch of food for $5, which really took care of the food insecurity needs. And as a matter of fact, kind of put our food pantry out of business. Folks just didn't need it anymore. It was a better system. We discovered that everyone has talents to bring to the table if we are just looking for them. In our food pantry, we had folks lining up, long lines, not much of a sense of pride on their faces. But the food co-op was totally different. They owned that. They were buyers in that club. It was like a buying club. And one of the first issues came up was our staff guy was not bringing the right assortment of food back, and they were grumbling about that. We said, well, why don't you get a buyer, or just elect a buyer and somebody to take your grocery list? And so they did. So now one of the members goes to the source and picks out the groceries. The next issue that came up was credit. What are we going to do if somebody doesn't have their $5 this week? We gonna lend them money? We going to extend them credit? Well, that launched into a big discussion. Who's credit worthy? What if they don't pay back? Do we kick them out? See, it wasn't our decision to make, because it was a decision of those that had skin in the game. It was their $5 that was being put at risk. And so it was a big discussion. In the midst of that discussion, somebody said, we're making some decisions here. We ought to be taking some notes. So they elected a secretary. They said, who's going to keep track of who's paid back in a timely way? Well, we need a treasurer. Somebody good with numbers? See, what's happening is the talents and the abilities that have been there all along, that we never saw while folks were standing in our free food line, in a system that brings out those talents and abilities, the created talents, the created purposes that God has plugged into all humanity begin to surface. There is a code that physicians follow called the Hippocratic Oath. It was made up by Hippocrates centuries before Christ. He said physicians need to have a code of conduct. And so he developed that code, and it became a practice that physicians to this day take. It's the Hippocratic Oath. I said, those of us that are in human services, we ought to have something like that. And so I will leave our attempt at that code with you tonight. The first point of that code is our golden rule. I'll never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. Number two, I'll limit my one-way giving to crises, but seek always to find ways for legitimate exchange. Three, I'll empower those that I serve through hiring, lending, and investing. Hiring, that's when Michael comes to my door and wants to wash our company van. And he does a good job, and I'm happy to pay him $25 for that. Now, some of my staff say, you're just empowering, you're causing him to go out. He's going to get high on that, and you're just indulging his lifestyle. And I said, no. That's an honorable transaction. Michael deserves to be compensated for a job well done. And when Michael leaves, he is a man with his freedom intact, and he can do anything he wants with that $25 for good or for ill. There is honorable exchange in hiring. Lending. Now, lending implies a measure of trust. When Ethel comes to my door and she says, can I borrow $20 until Saturday? I give it to her and don't even ask why, because I know on Saturday she'll be back with my $20. Just got a cash flow problem. But when Julie comes to my door and asks for $20, I say, now wait a second, let's get that last $20 that you borrowed, let's get that taken care of before we talk about any more. Let's go ahead and pay that off. There's accountability in lending. It's an honorable exchange. And then investing. A young man in our community who's a pretty good house painter, has worked for a company. But he wants to go into business on his own. Now, that's not it's not a big investment, but he doesn't have the capital to do it. So he asked me if I will help capitalize his business. an investment in his business. And I think that's a good idea, and I bring some other friends into it. And so we become, in a sense, like owners for his business. That means that we have a vested interest in seeing that business succeed. And so we're going to open up our contacts to ensure that this business will succeed. There's self-interest in that. The highest form of charity, I believe, is making money with the poor. Not making money on the poor, not making money for the poor, but making money with the poor. The highest form of charity. Number 4, I'll put the interest of the poor above my own self-interest or that of my organization or church, even when it means setting aside my own agenda. One of our staff women went to an educational conference in Africa, international education. And during one of the breaks, they were sitting around and some of the educators were talking, and an African educator said, "You know, there's some about you Americans that I've never understood." She said, "What is it about you that loves to paint so much?" She said, "When the Americans would come into our village, they'd let us out of school early and tell us to go out and get mud and stones and trash up the outside of the school so the Americans would have something to paint." She said they painted that school 4 different times the 3 years I was a student there. She said, "I just can't figure out why you love to paint so much." Well, you have to raise the question, whose agenda is this about? Whose interests are they about? Number 5, I'll listen carefully to the spoken and unspoken needs of those I serve, knowing that oftentimes those clues may be hidden. And the only way you really get to know what the true needs are is to build a relationship over time. That's costly, it's time-consuming. But it's the only way that I know to understand the real needs. And then 6, that's the same as the final point of the Hippocratic Oath. And with that I end. Above all, to the best of my ability, I will do no harm. Amen? Amen.